If you run a plant, a hospital, a school system, a city, or a large commercial operation and you open your electric bill, you stare at the fuel adjustment charge or the fuel rider line and think, I don't really know what this is, but it's definitely adding up. This episode is for you. You're already spending far more time thinking about electricity than any normal person would want to because utilities and vendors keep adding complexity and cost into the equation. Fuel adjustment charges are one of the most confusing pieces of that puzzle. So today we're decoding fuel adjustment charges and riders. This is part one. By the time we're done, you will know exactly what these charges are, why they exist, and when they turn into a competitive disadvantage, and what you should be tracking so you can make better decisions about projects and contracts that touch your electricity usage. I am Daniel Burke. This is Energy Answers by Tactical Energy Group. So, if you're a plant manager, a facility manager, a superintendent, a COO, or an energy manager at a manufacturer, a commercial real estate portfolio, a school system, a hospital, or a large commercial facility, this episode is built for you. We're going to talk about fuel adjustment charges at the level where you can sit down with finance and your board and have a clear, educated conversation. So let me start with a straight answer to the core question. How can we mitigate the financial impact of fluctuating fuel adjustment charges on our energy budget? That's a good question. So here is the short version. Fuel adjustment charges and riders are variable per kilowatt hour line items that pass through the difference between what your utility actually pays for fuel and what was assumed in base rates. You cannot control global fuel markets and you cannot opt out of that mechanism, but you can do three things. Understand how exposed you are, track the behavior of that line item over time, and deliberately reduce the number of kilowatt hours that are exposed to it. In part one, this episode, we're going to focus on understanding and tracking. And in part two and other episodes in the Energy Answers series, we'll go deeper into mitigation levers. Now, let's lay the foundation. First, what exactly are fuel adjustment charges and riders? Fuel adjustment charges, sometimes called fuel cost adjustment or cost of fuel adjustment, fuel rider or purchased power adjustment, are variable charges on your bill that reflect the changing cost of fuels used to generate electricity or the electricity your utility buys from others. They sit on top of your base rates. Base rates cover the fixed side, building and maintaining power plants, poles, wires, transformers, and the rest of the system. Those base rates are set in formal rate cases, and they're baked in for several years. Inside that base rate, regulators and the utility agree on a base fuel cost that is a forecast. The problem, though, is quite simple. Fuel prices do not sit still for several years. Natural gas, coal, oil, purchased power, those costs move with markets. So, regulators allow utilities to track the difference between that base fuel forecast and the actual fuel costs they incur, and then pass that difference through to you as a separate rate per kilowatt hour. So, at a decision maker level, a fuel adjustment charge is a correction factor. It's the utility saying, what we actually paid for fuel was different from what was assumed, so here's the true up. Now, how does that show up on your bill? I'll walk you through the mechanics in simple terms. During a rate case, the commission and the utility agree on a base fuel cost. Think of it as we expect fuel to average this number of dollars per megawatt hour over the next several years. That amount is built into the energy base rate. But as time goes on, the utility tracks its real fuel costs, natural gas purchases, coal, nuclear fuel, purchased power, all of it, each and every month or every quarter, and they compare what they actually spent on fuel to what the base rates would have recovered for fuel at the same sales volume. Hopefully, you're tracking with me. If actual fuel costs are higher than the base assumption, there's a shortfall. If they're lower, there's a surplus. They take that difference, divide it by the total number of kilowatt hours sold in the period, and that gives a rate, so many cents per kilowatt hour. That rate is the fuel adjustment charge. It's multiplied by your kilowatt hours for the month, and it shows up as its own line item, the fuel adjustment charge or fuel rider with a rate and a total dollar amount for the billing period. If the adjustment rate is positive, it adds cost. If it's negative, it's technically a credit. In reality, many of you have mainly seen positive numbers in recent years, which is a negative thing. There is regulatory oversight here. Utilities have to file detailed reports, and commissions perform what are called prudence reviews, asking, did you buy fuel in a reasonable way? Were you efficient? Or did you make poor decisions that customers should not have to cover? On paper, this is a very straightforward pass-through mechanism, not a profit center. So that's the theory. And let's talk about why utilities like it, what it means for you, and everything else you might want to know. From the utility side, fuel adjustment mechanisms exist for three reasons. First, financial stability. Without this kind of mechanism, if fuel prices run up sharply, the utility would be eating that cost until they can get a new rate case approved. That is not sustainable if you want a grid that actually works and power that's available when you flip the switch. Second, it avoids constant rate cases. Rate cases are long, expensive, and highly political. By peeling fuel out into a separate rider, regulators can leave base rates alone longer and still let the utility recover actual fuel costs. Third, it avoids baking heavily padded fuel forecasts into base rates. Without a rider, a risk-averse utility might assume very high fuel prices for the entire rate period and set base rates accordingly. With a rider, in theory, base rates can be lower and the rider corrects in either direction. In that narrow sense, there are moments where a fuel adjustment mechanism can benefit customers. When fuel prices collapse, the adjustment rate can go negative and credit your bill. A utility with diverse, well-managed assets can keep that line item relatively modest compared to a utility that is all in on a single volatile fuel. But from an operator's seat, here is where my view is. Fuel adjustment charges by themselves do not necessarily help you. They're just one of the ways the system passes costs through. Where this either helps or hurts you is in how your specific utility manages its generation assets and purchased power over time. If a utility manages those assets in a customer-centric way, constantly asking, how do we give our commercial and industrial customers stable, reasonable costs? And they build and retire assets with that as the top priority, then your exposure to wild swings and fuel costs can be lower than your competitors in other utility territories. But on the other hand, if a utility makes generation decisions driven more by ideology than by customer cost and stability, those decisions push more of your bill into fuel and purchased power that float with markets. Then the fuel adjustment line becomes a real burden to you. You are overexposed to someone else's bets. There's nothing inherently evil about a fuel cost adjustment mechanism. Markets move. Utilities do need a way to recover legitimate fuel costs. What I care about is whether the way they manage assets and contracts overexposes manufacturers and other operators to unnecessary volatility. So let's talk about how this feels inside your operation. The single biggest problem with fuel adjustment charges for you is budget volatility. If you're running a plant and you build a budget for electricity, you're not just budgeting for the base energy rate and the demand charges. This floating per kilowatt hour line item can go from being 10% of your bill to 20, 30, maybe more, depending on your territory and rate. We've seen periods where cost of fuel adjustment increased by nearly 3,000%, adding almost 3 cents per kilowatt hour to bills on a specific rate. That's incredibly costly. If you're consuming millions of kilowatt hours per month, that is not pocket change. It's real money that was not in the budget when you set pricing for your products. That makes it harder to price what you sell. It makes it harder to evaluate capital projects. If you're looking at a large equipment upgrade or a new process and you do not understand how much of your bill is floating with fuel markets, your payback math is simply not complete. And on top of that, you have almost no direct control over the underlying commodity markets. You are not trading natural gas or coal. You're not running the portfolio, yet you are absorbing the volatility. The other frustrating piece is the lag. Often, the fuel adjustment charge you see this month reflects fuel costs from a prior period. So you're responding to a line item that is, in a sense, a history lesson. That can make it even harder to explain internally, well, why did this happen now? What did we do? Often the answer is nothing. It's the cost of the system that you're actually running on. So let me clear up a few misconceptions that I have heard from operators. The first one is that the utility is getting rich off of this line item. Under a standard fuel adjustment mechanism, the utility is not allowed to profit on fuel. They're supposed to recover their actual prudent fuel costs dollar for dollar. Commissions look at those numbers in detail. You can absolutely argue about what prudent means, and you can absolutely push on how they manage assets overall, but the mechanism itself is not designed as a margin line. Second, this is a hidden fee. It's not hidden. It may be buried in small print on your bill, but the mechanism is spelled out in the tariff, which is public. You should not need a law degree to read it, but it's not a secret. The third misconception: my utility could just buy cheaper fuel if they really wanted to. In practice, they operate under reliability requirements and long term contracts. They cannot simply wake up in the morning, cancel everything, and buy whatever's cheapest that day. That is not how the system and system planning works. That does not mean every decision they make is perfect. It does mean the story is far more complicated than they're being lazy and they will not pick the lowest number that they have available to them. Fourth, if I go renewable, fuel adjustment charges disappear. Installing solar and other distributed resources can reduce how many kilowatt hours you're buying from the grid and therefore reduce your exposure. And we'll talk about that more in part 2. But as long as you're connected to a grid that still leans on fuels, any electricity you buy from that grid will carry some version of a fuel or purchased power adjustment. Even if you have a separate agreement for certain megawatt hours, your backup and supplemental usage is still tied into the mechanism. Last, the fuel adjustment charge is just a straight percentage of my bill. It's not a percentage, it's a cost per kilowatt hour. Its share of your total bill depends on how high that rate is in a given month and how many kilowatt hours you used. So, if this is how the mechanism works, what should you actually be tracking? Let me give you a simple checklist. First, track the fuel adjustment rate itself every single month, the cents per kilowatt hour. Write it down, put it in a spreadsheet, look at it over a 12-month period, over 24 months, over 3 years. You want to see the pattern. Second, calculate what percentage of your total bill that line item represents. If your bill is $100,000 and $20,000 of that is fuel adjustment, well, that's 20%. Write that down every month as well. You want to track the trend. Third, understand your utility's generation mix. You do not need to memorize every plant, but you should know, is this utility heavily reliant on natural gas? Coal? Does it have a meaningful share of nuclear, hydro, or other low fuel cost resources? The more concentrated they are in a volatile fuel, the more sensitive your fuel adjustment line is to that commodity. Fourth, pay attention to the basic commodity trends tied to that mix. If you know your utility leans on natural gas, you want to have at least a rough sense of whether natural gas prices are trending up or down over the next year. You do not have to become a trader. You just want to avoid unnecessary surprises. Lastly, if you can get historical fuel adjustment data from your utility or from past bills, look at 5 to 10 years, a full window. Where did that line item usually sit? What were the extremes? That helps you understand what a normal period looks like versus being in unusual territory. Now, I want to come back to the part I care about most: how utility decisions either protect or hurt you when it comes to this mechanism. Fuel adjustment charges are just one of the components of the bill. Standing alone, they're neutral. What matters is how big a share of your total electricity costs they represent and how violently they move. When a utility manages generation assets with customer cost and stability as the top priority, they can make decisions that reduce your exposure. Diversifying the mix, avoiding over-reliance on the most volatile fuels, thinking carefully about how any new investment will show up in real customer bills, not just how it might appear in a PR presentation. Customers under that kind of careful management tend to have more stable experiences, even though the same fuel markets exist for everyone. On the other hand, when a utility is driven more by narrative than by cost and stability, and they retire or build assets in ways that push more cost into variable fuel and purchased power, they raise the likelihood that the fuel adjustment line becomes a much larger share of your bill and a bigger vulnerability. From your side of the meter, you cannot change that mix, but you absolutely can decide how seriously you take it, how carefully you track it, and how aggressively you pursue ways to reduce the number of kilowatt hours that you expose to it. So let me pause and give you my personal take in one place. In my view, fuel adjustment charges are not for you or against you. Obviously, they're a symptom of decisions made at the system level. What I want you to see is that utility generation planning either narrows or widens the target that you're standing on. Like I said before, we've seen a real world period where the cost of fuel adjustment on a specific rate went up nearly 3,000%. It was 2,999%, adding almost 3 cents per kilowatt hour on top of everything else. Customers on that rate did not suddenly become less efficient operators. They simply happened to be standing in the wrong place when certain decisions met certain markets. So the question for you is not, do I like fuel adjustment charges? It's, how exposed am I to the behavior of this line item, and what am I doing about that exposure inside the walls where I actually control the situation? In part two, we're going to get into energy efficiency, on site generation, demand response, and procurement strategies as ways to reduce exposed kilowatt hours or stabilize your all in rates. For today, I want to close with a clear recap and some questions that you can take into a morning huddle. Here are the essentials. One, fuel adjustment charges and riders are variable per kilowatt hour line items that pass through the difference between actual fuel and purchased power costs and the base fuel costs baked into base rates. Two, they exist so utilities can recover the legitimate fuel costs without constant rate cases. They're overseen by regulators and are supposed to be pass-throughs, not profit centers. Three, from your side, the main pain is budget volatility, planning difficulty, and being exposed to global commodity markets you do not control. Four, the real story is not just the mechanism, it's how your utility's asset decisions either dampen or amplify your exposure to fuel cost volatility. Five, your first job is not to fix the mechanism, it's to understand and track it. The cost per kilowatt hour, its percentage of your bill, the utility's generation mix, and the basic commodity trends tied to that mix. Now, look, I don't run your plant. That's your job. My job is to translate the mess of utility billing and give you questions and perhaps leverage you're not getting from someone's pitch deck or the rate book, or certainly not utility customer service. The bottom line on fuel adjustment charges and riders is this: you cannot make them disappear, but you can stop being surprised by them. When you track the behavior of that line item, understand how much of your bill it represents, and deliberately work to lower the number of kilowatt hours that are exposed to it, you turn fuel adjustment from a mystery that keeps wrecking your budget into one more variable you can manage with intention. So here are a few questions you can take into a morning huddle with finance, operations, or your qualified energy partner. First question: over the last 12 months, what has our fuel adjustment charge or equivalent rider been each month in cost per kilowatt hour, in cents per kilowatt hour? Do we have that graphed or tracked anywhere? Second, for each of those months, what percentage of our total electricity bill was the fuel adjustment charge? Third, do we have a clear summary of our utilities generation mix and which fuels drive most of our fuel adjustment behavior? Fourth, when we evaluate energy projects or new loads, are we explicitly accounting for the portion of our cost that floats with the fuel markets, the fuel adjustment charges, or are we only using the base energy rate in our payback math? That would be a big mistake, but it's one that's easy to make. If you do not have good answers to those questions just yet, that should be your starting point. Now, I want to speak to two groups who could be listening. If you found this helpful, but you're not currently in the middle of a decision about your electricity, the best thing that you can do is very simple. Send this episode to another operator, a superintendent, or an executive you know who's trying to manage skyrocketing energy costs. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Share it with them so they can have a clearer picture too. But if you're in a second group where this is not theoretical, you are on the hook right now for decisions that will affect your exposure to fuel adjustment charges over the next 3 to 5 years. I built something specifically for you. It's called the Energy Decision Blueprint. And here's who it's for: It's for Indiana commercial and industrial operators with a serious electric bill who are actually considering or being pitched decisions that interact with energy, with fuel adjustment exposure in the next 3 to 6 months. That might be a major equipment upgrade, a new facility, a project that changes your load profile, or a supply side offering that someone is trying to sell you. Here's what you get. First, we start with a short discovery and fit call. The goal is to make sure there's enough data and enough potential upside or downside around your fuel adjustment exposure for it to be worth going deeper. If it is, we pull data. That means at least the last 12 months of bills, interval data when it's available, and context from you on your shifts, major loads, and any constraints on how you can run. Third, we schedule a 60 to 90-minute working session. And in that session, I'll sit down with you. And when it makes sense, I'll bring in one of our other rate experts. And we'll plug your data into the same rate engine and tools we use for existing customers and walk through in detail what your bill is actually doing today around fuel adjustment charges and the other main billable line items, how the main options you're considering would realistically behave on your tariff, including that floating piece, and what the realistic upside or downside range looks like if you move forward or if you opt out and stay where you are. Fourth, you'll get a simple board-ready summary, usually 1 or 2 pages, and it lays out your current situation, the realistic range of outcomes if you implement or do not implement the change, and my view on whether there's a real economic play and under what conditions. For qualified accounts, this energy decision blueprint is free. And there are only 2 acceptable outcomes. If there's a real play, we'll show you exactly what it looks like. If there's not, we will tell you that as soon as possible so you can stop wasting time and energy on a concept that will not actually reduce your costs or improve your reliability. So if you want that for your energy management project and the decisions you're weighing around it, go to tacticalenergygroup.com, look for Energy Decision Blueprint, and use the link there to raise your hand. Again, it's tacticalenergygroup.com. Thanks for listening to Energy Answers by Tactical Energy Group. If this helped, send it to another operator who's dealing with the same headaches and visit tacticalenergygroup.com to get more practical tools for your facilities.